Palantir.
Palantir, what comes to mind? Just like anyone.
Bro, just like say shit, bro.
Well, food thieves.
Netanyahu.
And thieves of other things.
Americans.
Yeah. Yeah. So, as I think many of you are also thinking about, there's also, I'm sure you're thinking about like the genocide in Gaza that happened, things like the West Bank wall, like built between like West Bank and Israel to separate Palestinian movement. And then beyond that, like other things too, like I mean the apartheid in Israel, like this image, for example, is highly inaccurate because it's someone going into a mall and being security searched, but the person is white and not Muslim, which it's racial profiling. They're only going to search you if you're Muslim. And finally, even down to things like baggage claim, like literal, like Muslim and Jewish, like baggage goes down a different path as they racial profile you at the airport. But this isn't what being Israeli meant to me initially. When I was younger, being Israeli to me was kind of just like, you know, my family, like food, like, you know, my hometown, like that I would grow up with, seeing like family, like visiting many, many years. It came down to things like ordering an incredible shawarma lafa and drinking it down with like biosh chola, which is like a malt beer. And then like, you know, like Tel Aviv's like beautiful beaches and like, you know, all these like, you know, buildings and like the Shuk HaKalma, like the market, like the Middle Eastern market in Tel Aviv, and, you know, incredible hummus. Like, oh my God, I miss that hummus. And I never really like reckoned with like the real like, you know, abuses going on in my country. Like, it was just kind of like something in the background. That is until October 7th. On October 7th, I was suddenly bombarded with just so much like bad news. I mean, it's like horrifying to think that like, you know, all these families and children like were killed, and like when I see those faces, like I think about like my cousins and my grandparents and like my family that's all in Israel. And I think it's in moments like these where like people can be so like blinded by grief that they kind of don't realize like what's going on the other side, and you can kind of justify a lot. So, you know, during this time there was also the split screen of what was happening in Gaza as, you know, we progressively got more information through the course of the war. And, you know, it took me a long time to be able to kind of reconcile these two sides because, you know, October 7th is such a traumatic event. And I think for me it took almost a year until I really meaningfully accepted like the atrocities that were going on in Gaza. And I think, you know, I'm sure like for Israelis growing up there, like it's even harder. It's truly like a hard thing to reconcile. But reconciling it was a truly like rewarding experience that led me to define what is my own Israeli identity. And yeah, now we'll begin. So I developed my Israeli identity here at UCLA, which, you know, as you may know, during, I think, our first years, or, you know, maybe like later years for some of you, was a very turbulent time after October 7th. I think suddenly, like, you know, my name and my nationality became something that meant something very different to a lot of people. Like, I grew up, like, people would ask me, like, oh, where's your name from? That's, like, a new name. I haven't heard that before. And, like, I would just be like, oh, yeah, it's, like, Israeli. And, you know, I never thought twice about it. And suddenly it became, like, the nationality that was committing genocide, you know, the nationality that people were aware of on campus. And meanwhile, like, terms such as, like, intifada, which were terms that I grew up with just associating with, like, violence against my family, became to be used widely on campus. And I think these kind of terms scared me a lot, especially during this, like, turbulent time. So, still kind of unwilling to critically examine this after the trauma of October 7th, I turned to the Israeli side on campus. And it was not much better. It was pretty awful, actually. So here we have, as you may know, Eli Tzaz charging headfirst antagonistically into the encampment and getting pretty meaningfully and rightfully turned away. You know, later turning around and saying, like, and debasing any real anti-Semitism allegations by saying, yeah, like, it's like Nazi Germany here. Like, this guy did not go through anything. Let's be for real. And meanwhile, like, the Israeli group chat that I was added to, like, just meeting someone who spoke Hebrew, started saying some pretty diabolical stuff. They were supporting, like, Elon Musk at one point, and I was like, you guys know he's, like, an anti-Semite, right? Like, the Great Replacement theory, you know? And in response, they told me to use Twitter for news and follow Elon Musk for my information.
I like the thumbs up.
So,
everyone gave us the thumbs up reaction.
It's actually my bad. Yeah, that's my bad.
Yeah, respects.
But yeah, it was horrifying to see this man be so celebrated in the Israeli community here on campus. And meanwhile, they were supporting these political figures that, like, my family had detested my whole life. So let's move on to that. So, this is going to be a long detour into Israeli politics and history. So, as an Ashkenazi Jew, my family has roots in Poland, Ukraine, Germany, and just Eastern Europe as a whole, right? Fleeing anti-Semitism and escaping the soon-to-happen Holocaust, my family and many others escaped to Israel in waves of immigration known as aliyahs. So the first and second aliyah were during the Ottoman rule of Israel. The first one was really small, and it established one of the first Jewish settlements in Palestine, one of which is called Petach Tikva, which is where my family lives in today. And it is to Tel Aviv what the valley is to LA. It's not a very interesting place, but it's the first Israeli settlement. And the second aliyah was also not large, but it led to the revival of Hebrew as a language. Hebrew wasn't initially spoken among Jews. We spoke like Yiddish and other languages. And it kind of became a unifying language for the Jews that were coming into Palestine. And the start of like Tel Aviv kind of began at this point as people started building suburbs on the outskirts of Jaffa. But later, more than half of these people would leave, who came during the second aliyah after the outbreak of World War I, and all the mess that came as a result of that. And the third aliyah you might know more about, the first two were relatively smaller, was a direct result of the Balfour Declaration, which many of you might have heard of. It was made in 1917 by the British government and kind of established Palestine as like a national like home for the Jewish people. It was relatively controversial for the time, and a lot of British didn't support it. But the Balfour Declaration really legitimized Zionism, and arguably like paved the way to the establishment of Israel because it kind of gave a big legitimate cause to something that wasn't really that popular among Jews or like Europeans at the time. At the same time, all these new people coming into Israel led to the establishment of the Haganah, which was initially just formed as a defensive force for the Yishuv. The Yishuv is just like all the early Jewish settlers pre-Israel. And the Haganah was later absorbed into the IDF and was the main like Zionist military force during the Israeli independence and the Nakba. And finally, the fourth aliyah occurred as a result of, again, more anti-Semitism. Kind of the leading factor for a lot of these is fleeing of anti-Semitism, and particularly in Poland during the fourth aliyah. And the last and fifth aliyah was arguably was the largest, and it consisted of a massive exodus of Jews fleeing from Nazism. This included my great-grandfather and all of my dad's family as well. And this massive increase of Jewish people really raised tensions in Palestine, and it eventually led to the British White Paper of 1939, which actually limited Jewish immigration. So the British kind of change up sides at this point as they see things destabilize. And at this point, the aliyahs continued illegally against the British White Papers as people were trying to help people flee the Holocaust and Nazism in Europe. It especially accelerated after World War II when members of the Jewish Brigade, who were enlisted by the British, or Jews enlisted by the British to fight in World War II, and they particularly fought in the Italy campaign. My great-grandfather was also one of these people. And when they returned, they helped Holocaust survivors escape after the end of World War II. And this also included my great-grandfather, who helped these survivors escape. I think these aliyahs really remain like a very core part of like the Zionist movement. I mean, you guys all know about like birthright, for example, right? Of like the idea of like, oh, as a Jew, you have like the right to travel to Israel. And I think it's definitely a complicated topic. I mean, I think for Palestinians, it's certainly like, it legitimizes and entrenches like, the rule that they live under. But on the other hand, I do also think it's important to note that like these people who were fleeing were like, they were refugees, right? It's not like we came in like well off. And I just think that's like an important complication to note. And I think something that, I would not be here alive today if it wasn't for the aliyahs and my family fleeing to Palestine. And, I also have a family friend who, for example, was in Ethiopia during like a famine. And because of an Israeli operation to take Ethiopian Jews to Israel, she's, alive and well today. So I think there's certainly something to be said about these aliyahs. Anyway, at this point, World War II is over, and the Jews don't really feel like they're getting much from the British anymore because the Nazis are gone. So the British become the enemy. And as a result, we see these two split-off groups, which you will learn plenty about more later, Irgun and Lehi, split off from the Haganah. And these were extremist groups that believed in revisionist Zionism, which means a Israel from the river to the sea, and they were willing to do any sort of violence to get that to happen. In fact, the Lehi admired Nazi authoritarian and totalitarian principles, and before World War II reached out to them to potentially form an alliance against the British. Relatively fringe groups, but still insane. Yeah?
So why specifically did the British become the enemy after they stopped being, I guess you could say, useful? Was it because of the immigration limitation?
It was because of the immigration limitations, and something that I should have noted as well is before the end of World War II, these two groups, the Irgun and Lehi, were fighting against the British already, as they saw them as a bigger enemy than the Nazis for some reason. I wonder why, it doesn't make any sense. But after World War II, we started to see the Haganah, which was the legitimate and much larger Israeli force, well, I guess Yishuv force at this point, join the fight against the British. And they primarily assisted from afar and carried out attacks on mostly just immigration officers who were British and brought more people into Palestine, while the Irgun and Lehi were in charge of actually attacking military targets. And here you can see pictured like the King David bombing, which was one of the largest terrorist attacks by Lehi and Irgun, where they tried to basically destroy any evidence that basically there was an agreement between all of these three groups to help fight the British, and it was put together by the sorry, one moment. It's put together. Sorry, it was put together by the Jewish organization, the Jewish Agency, and essentially they didn't want to be implicated in these attacks, so they chose to bomb the British.
Sorry, is it okay if I ask?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I read about this like a while ago, but I forgot. Why do you know like why the British did the Balfour Declaration, even if
yeah,
because it was unpopular in Britain, so why did they do that?
It was based off of a geopolitical calculation. They felt that if the Jews controlled Palestine, they could probably have more power in the region. Eventually, they kind of changed their minds as they saw the chaos go on, and that's why the white papers came in. And in fact, the British actually assisted the Palestinians during the Nakba against the Zionist forces.
Okay.
But yeah, so at this point, we start to see a very notable shift where Haganah kind of becomes like initially just a defense force for these for the Yishuv, for the Jewish settlers who were there. They started becoming more offensive, and this would really pave the way for like later revolutionary violence. And as you all know, the Nakba and Israeli independence. So, on the 29th of November, 1947, the UN partition plan was passed with the support of Zionist Jews, and was widely rejected by Palestinians due to the massive loss of their land it would, of course, entail. This led to a massive increase in violence between the Jewish and Palestinian groups who were there, and massive violence on both sides. So we had the Fajr bus attacks, which were done by Palestinian groups against Jews, and then progressively these became more militarized, and there were massacres that the Jews did as well to the Palestinians. And as they grew more militarized, we started to see some awful atrocities occur, and the horrors of the Nakba. And during this time, of course, the British intervened in favor of the Palestinians. And after enough time of this militarization, the Haganah started to gain kind of an upper hand in this conflict. And on April of 1948, the Yishuv forces moved to the offensive from the defensive and instigated what is known as Plan Dalet. And the goal of Plan Dalet was to prepare Palestine for the establishment of a Jewish state by so-called fortifying Jewish population centers. This fortification involved sieging Palestinian villages, expelling any of their inhabitants, and poisoning their wells with biological agents as well, as was found out later. In other words, the plan was ethnic cleansing. This is where the worst atrocities of the Nakba really began, and the plan resulted in the forced removal of more than half of the Palestinian population, and the destruction of more than 500 Arab villages. Above is arguably one of the worst of these massacres, the Deir Yassin massacre. This was carried out by Lehi and Irgun, which were the two extremist groups. However, it was also supported by Haganah, so you can't fully de-implicate them in that. In this massacre, 110 Palestinian villagers were brutally killed and paraded through West Jerusalem, and the village of Deir Yassin is now resettled by Israelis as part of an Israeli village called Givat Shul now. And then finally, on the 14th of May 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, declared the establishment of a Jewish state. And this took the war to a new stage. Instead of just violence against Palestinians and civilians, it became violence against these Arab nations that invaded them. There was now Jordan and Egypt forces who were in the region to protect the Palestinians. Eventually, the Jews won, as you know, and these borders were established, the Green Line borders, in an armistice between these regions, and Jordan would retain control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which contains the old city of Jerusalem, and the Egyptians would control the Gaza Strip. These borders remain the only internationally recognized borders of Israel till today, and while they were intended to be temporary, of course, remain pretty significant. And as you can see, they kind of roughly follow the UN partition, but they took more land as a result of the conflict. So, now we move into politics. Israeli politics is very complicated, and you're going to see a massive mess of things go on, but I promise it's all worth it. So, after Israeli independence, a democracy was formed, and the militant groups needed to become part of the government, right? So, the Haganah basically became absorbed into the IDF. It was kind of the main military group. And the Irgun, after some uncomfortable tension and potential civil war, also absorbed. However, Lehi was not absorbed, and they were dissolved. However, they had to do just one last terrorist attack on a UN mediator seeking peace. So, yeah, Lehi is a wonderful organization. So soon Israel held a referendum on their newly created political parties. Following the election, the dominant voices were that of the socialists. The socialists actually controlled Israel for decades. These groups, these main political parties were Mapai and Mapam, which sound very similar. And Mapai was formed by Ben-Gurion, who was the prime minister at the time. And meanwhile, members of the Irgun formed the right-wing Chayut party, which later became the Likud, which you may know as Benjamin Netanyahu's party. So a truly wonderful lineage for that party, truly great. And finally, members of the Palmach, which was Haganah's elite strike force, formed the Mapam party, and they were highly influenced by the kibbutzim movement, which is where these kind of militants ended up where they lived during the revolution and beforehand. As these were communist villages scattered throughout Israel, which still exist today and account for a significant portion of the GDP. I have family. One of the brightest lights that I want to note during this time was Mapam's early platform was actually that of Jewish-Arab coexistence, and they were opposed to the expulsion of Palestinians during the Nakba, even calling for a Palestinian right to return to be instigated. And this was, right after independence. This platform was really driven by Aaron Cohen and Aharon Zisling, which you can see pictured above. And despite the fact that this platform was later moderated when they were elected to the government, Aharon Zisling still won a seat in the Knesset. And this was something that he said. He truly, I think, reflected and was aware of the atrocities that were committed. And I think that's very powerful that even during this early time in Israel where you would think people would kind of be on the same page, people were already aware of what was going on. Aaron Zisling also helped rescue thousands of Jewish children from the Nazis and during the Third Reich, and he assisted in the founding of the Palmach, which is the elite division of the Haganah. So, now we get to this is arguably in some ways, while the Nakba and the Israeli War for Independence, actually established the state of Israel, nothing really had a bigger impact on Israel's, real power and, kind of impunity over the region other than the Six-Day War. This happened following a buildup of tensions with Israel's neighbors and the buildup of Egyptian troops on its borders. Israel decided to launch a surprise attack as they believed war was going to come. And within only 6 days, Israel captured the entire Sinai Peninsula of Egypt. They've captured the Golan Heights of Syria, and the Jordan-occupied West Bank, and the Egyptian-occupied Gaza Strip, and very importantly, East Jerusalem containing the Old City. In an unprecedented victory, Israel lost less than 1,000 troops, while the Arab states lost more than 15,000. This really had an insane effect on the Israel's own self-image, because it just gave them a sense of massive power. Instead of relinquishing or annexing all this land, Israel chose kind of neither and kept the state of all of its new territories ambiguous. with the exception of East Jerusalem, of course, which was annexed by Israel, because the prospect of having like this unified like holy city under Israel was just too tempting. And here you can see like IDF troops like proudly parading through the holy city. You can also see here, if you visited Jerusalem, you may have visited like the Wailing Wall, which is one of the holiest sites to Jews. To clear out that wonderful plaza that you can see there for all the Jews, they actually demolished an entire like Arab neighborhood that was placed in front of it as soon as they killed them. But this kind of put Israel on the path to what the revisionist Zionists kind of always wanted, because now they could kind of get what they wanted. I mean, it would be difficult, but they now had military control over all this land from the river to the sea, right? So this time you see both the right and the labor governments allow for the expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank and in Gaza, which would later be destroyed. So, on the 17th of May 1977, the Israeli right won a plurality of seats in the Knesset for the first time in Israeli history. This broke like decades of socialist rule. Likud, which was a party founded by this guy, Menachem Begin, over there in that photo, gained. He was once the head of the extremist Irgun, was now the prime minister of Israel. Meanwhile, the Alignment, which was a coalition of socialist parties, suffered a massive loss. Begin's administration was one with a complicated legacy, to say the least. He highly liberalized Israel's economy and led to a massive rise in inequality and poverty within the state of Israel, despite being voted in by the marginalized working class. Wonder if that reminds you of anyone. However, Begin also participated in the Camp David Accords, where he gave over the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt and created a state of peace between the two countries. And under this agreement, Israel would return the Sinai Peninsula and pave the way to Palestinian self-rule in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Of course, they only really followed the former portion, giving over the Sinai Peninsula, but they still rapidly expanded settlements in the West Bank and Gaza. This, of course, makes complete sense. I mean, Begin's Irgun was, one of the fringe revisionist Zionist groups of the past. So they perpetrated the Der Yunis massacre, as talked before. It kind of follows. Begin would later fall out of power after intervening in the Lebanese civil war in favor of the Christian militants. Militants which later carried out a mass killing of Palestinian and Lebanese Shia Muslims, known as the Sabra and Shatila massacre in September 1982. This led to massive protests in Tel Aviv by citizens who were outraged by the extent of this massacre. And eventually, hundreds of thousands marched for Tel Aviv. And a later report even found the defense minister of Begin, Ariel Sharon, personally responsible for this massacre. Following the death of his wife and remorse from this massacre, as well as the massive pressure on him, Begin later resigned in October 1983 and handed the office to his old friend Yitzhak Shamir, who was the leader of Lehi in the past. So, now we start to move into a situation where Israel kind of realizes it doesn't quite have impunity. On the 9th of December 1987, in the Jabalah refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, an Israeli truck driver crashed into a set of parked cars, killing 4 Palestinian workers, 3 of which were from the refugee camp. This outraged Palestinians, and they saw it as a response to the killing of an Israeli in Gaza a couple of days earlier, and this sparked the First Intifada. During the First Intifada, Palestinians rose up against the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, engaging in nonviolent and violent protests, civil disobedience, riots, and terrorist attacks. The Israeli government cracked down on this with excessive military force under Yitzhak Shamir's government, who was, again, a Lehi member. And approximately 80,000 soldiers were deployed with live rounds to quell the Intifada. By the end of the First Intifada and the signing of the Oslo Accords, 179 to 200 Israelis were killed, while 1,962 Palestinians were killed. This kind of paved the way for a change in Israel, as it was clear impunity wasn't going to work. And under this pretense, we have Yitzhak Rabin. And I would say during this time, Israel was brought closer to a state of peace than it ever has in its history. Yitzhak Rabin was once a member of the Palmach, and under his administration, Israel negotiated out the Oslo Accords and peace with Jordan, which, while were imperfect treaties, were greatly improved the lives of Palestinians and created a sort of pathway to some degree. So on the 13th of July 1992, Yitzhak Rabin retook office. He had office beforehand, and had the first labor victory in 15 years. Israel had chosen Rabin's platform of safety for peace rather than safety for violence. Under Rabin's administration, the Oslo Accords were signed, as discussed, and now we're going to go look into what happened with these Oslo Accords. So, under the Oslo Accords, Israel recognized the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, as a legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. This group was previously considered a non-negotiable terrorist organization, with Begin even stating that he would refuse to negotiate with them even if they recognized the state of Israel. So the PLO, in exchange for its recognition, recognized Israel, and the democratically elected Palestinian Authority was also created to govern the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Critically, however, and an important, I think, thing to note, is the Oslo Accords were not really in line with a real two-state solution yet. As under the Accords, Israel didn't have to recognize a Palestinian state, they just had to recognize the Palestinian Authority, and they were still to remain in charge of the borders between Egypt and Jordan, and to have complete air and sea control, and as well to hold the right to protect their illegal settlements. So, definitely not an ideal agreement. Israel would maintain control of vast swaths of land containing Israeli settlements, which is Area C, this blue area in the photo, while the Palestinian Authority would only rule over Area A and B, even though Area B would also still hold a partial Israeli military presence. I'd say regardless of these shortcomings, the Oslo Accords were meaningful and a promising step forward, and they were always intended to be a first step. I think that's really key to note, is that the plan was for full Israeli withdrawal in later agreements, and they would later talk about it and dissolve the civil administration which was ruling Gaza and the West Bank at the time, and still does. However, the revisionist Zionists were not happy with this process. And in this photo, you can see Netanyahu carrying a coffin with Rabin's name on it. This was after being warned that there were potential attempts on Rabin's life, but he did it anyway. So the revisionist Zionists basically viewed Rabin as literally an enemy of the state and an enemy of the Jewish people, and just organized widespread riots throughout the country. Despite being warned by the Israeli chief of security, Rabin continued to not take higher security measures, not wearing a bulletproof vest or having an armored car, and eventually this bravery ended up costing him. And on November 30th, 1995, Yitzhak Rabin was shot by a far-right extremist, Yigal Amir. On the right is the memorial commemorating his life in Tel Aviv at the very place that he was shot. My family reflects on the murder of Yitzhak Rabin as a genuinely traumatizing memory. My grandfather remembers it as almost a personal traumatic event. He was a close friend of my great-grandfather's, in fact. They both served in the Palmach together, and also went to the same school. And to them, this was kind of the loss of this truly incredible figurehead for peace in Israel. I mean, I think, there's a lot to criticize. I definitely think he was not a perfect individual, and the peace was not perfect, but I think this is the most tangible step towards peace in, between Israel and Palestine that I think has ever happened, right? And, once he was dead, I think the path for peace in Israel became a lot more complicated, and I think we end up kind of on the path that Israel wanted to take. And, I think it's hard to think about, if he hadn't been assassinated, how the country would be. So, Rabin then later, his good friend Peles ended up taking control later, but during this time and during the fear established by this, it was hard to hold on. As Rabin's assassination came at a very opportune time for Netanyahu and the Likud party. During Rabin's negotiations with Jordan and the PLO and the Oslo Accords, Israeli civilians were continually targeted and roiled by terrorist attacks organized by Hamas in protest of the peace movement. We had the Dizengoff Center suicide bombing, and this one is, for me as someone who's been to Tel Aviv, this is the center, central shopping mall in the city. So, imagine seeing that it's been bombed, in the center of the city. I would be horrified. And we had road bus bombings as well in Jerusalem. So Israelis were very, very scared. And it's also difficult too, because these were organized against the peace process. I think, it certainly created they don't want peace, maybe we shouldn't do it, right? And these were highly fatal bombings, as 14 died in the Dizengoff Center bombings and 27 died in the Jaffa road bus bombings. all of this upheaval made Netanyahu's promise of safety through security all that more appealing, as he could make the argument, oh, Palestinians don't want peace, we need to oppress them. And eventually, Bibi won election against Shimon Peres, who was a good friend of Rabin's and served temporarily after him, in a very, very tight election. And with Bibi's election, the Oslo process kind of just left the political focus, and his further negotiations with the PA, while they did exist and they did happen and they did lead to supposedly good things in writing, were hollow. He didn't follow through really on a lot of his promises. Meanwhile, Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank only just continued to grow. And as you may know, with the tides of Israeli politics, Benjamin Netanyahu would fall in and out of power all the time, but he would always rise up again and wash ashore. Which leads us to today, and these wonderful people. So, we have a truly rotten Benjamin Netanyahu that's washed ashore today to the prime ministership. Undeterred by ongoing corruption investigations into his premiership, Netanyahu created a coalition and took power with the sort of political parties you would kind of expect to already be in hell talking to Hitler. His defense minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, is perhaps the most disgusting person of his West Bank, of his cabinet. Ben-Gvir currently lives as a settler in the Israeli-occupied West Bank and previously had a career as a lawyer for Jewish extremists. Nowadays, he can pursue his passion in politics by pushing ideas such as Kahanism to the mainstream, which is a blatantly violent racist movement supporting the expelling of Palestinians from their land and considering them inherent enemies of the Jewish people who should have no voting rights. This ideology can trace its roots to the banned political party that is recognized by the US and by Israel as a terrorist organization. Meanwhile, we have Smotrich in the middle, another resident of the West Bank, of course, and was put in charge of the civil administration, which runs the West Bank. And he believes in rapidly expanding Israeli settlements and against Palestinian statehood, and therefore was just the perfect fit for the role of governing Palestinians. I don't think this administration's actions in Gaza come as any news to you, but a fun fact is that Netanyahu actually provided arms to Hamas because he felt it would, create a nice pretense for his power. At least I would think so, because it creates a counterbalance to, movement towards Palestinian peace. Because you can always point to Hamas's violence and what's going on in Gaza as being like, oh, Palestinians can't handle peace, they're crazy, right? Things like that. And it literally undermines a unified Palestinian state, which eventually backfired on him with October 7th, but still insane to think of. Yeah.
One question. Why are there photos so... What is this photo of him, bro? He looks like a Discord mod, bro.
No, I know, he does. It's like, this is the main photo of him on Wikipedia. It's just he couldn't even try to not look evil.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah.
He literally just can't.
You know the picture of the guy with the chess pieces?
yeah, I swear to God, bro, yeah, it's that.
It's weird that it's stateless and there's no flag behind him. It's just he's in a cave.
He's just in a cave.
His lighting
He's in,
director
his own
was
little circle of hell.
Yeah.
Already.
I'm thinking CNN election coverage where you just see both the mug shots in front of a gray wall.
No, he's truly a wonderful individual that we have, as our security minister who controls our police. Anyway.
Dude, it's like evil Birdly, bro.
Yeah.
Independent party, 0% vote.
Birdly?
Yeah. So, besides, committing genocide, they've also expanded and legitimized West Bank settlements at an unprecedented rate and sought to quell democracy, of course. This resulted in a series of anti-democratic reforms, the first of which put this guy in charge of our entire country's police, which is not done anything bad at all. It's led to the mass suppress of pro-Palestinian protests and the arrests of Palestinian activists, as he just controls the police now. The second of which was the proposed judicial overhaul, and this led to widespread protests. Israel's judiciary is one of the most trusted and revered institutions of Israel's government, with both a majority of Jewish and Arab citizens having strong faith in the institution. Israel's Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled against settlements in the West Bank in favor of Arab citizens in anti-discrimination cases and protected freedom of speech. Of course, the Supreme Court is not perfect, they could have done more, but I think it stands as a positive, institution for the state of Israel and a great counterbalance to the government, which makes it a great target of this new fascist administration. they proposed legislation in the Knesset, which is their legislature, which would allow the overruling of any Israeli Supreme Court decisions just by reintroducing the legislation and passing it again with a majority. Additionally, it would have helped them kind of better select who's on the courts. This would also probably help Netanyahu weasel his way out of the corruption trials he was engaged in. So I think besides being able to further their fascist agenda, it would also help Netanyahu hold on to power. Yeah.
Did Israel ever think that term limits would be a good idea?
Israeli politics is kind of just like diabolical. It's no one actually directly elects the prime minister, except for that one random election where they decided to do that. That was kind of something that I was trying to like weasel my way around, but it's kind of just done through the legislator. So it doesn't make too much sense to have like legislator, too much sense to have term limits. But yeah, they decided to directly elect them like one time for some reason. I don't know.
I mean, with most countries that have a prime minister as the main
It's just like
person in power, that's just whichever legislative party is in power.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you can't be like, okay, this party can only be in power for 4 years.
Yeah.
Although maybe you
Yeah.
could, I don't know, someone make a case for it.
Yeah.
But like India's prime minister has also been prime minister for an exceedingly long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of just all comes down to like it's all about coalition building in like the Israeli government. Like you'll see parties switch up a lot, merge. Like if I were to trace the actual direct lineage of all these parties, it would take like maybe a whole nother lecture. Like Israeli politics is like diabolical. But anyway, this clearly anti-democratic Israeli judicial reform bill, which, by the way, when I was reading about it on Wikipedia, like had nothing about its merits, and then said critics say this would hurt human rights, women's rights, Arab rights, and it just kept going, and I'm like, this prompted massive protests all throughout Israel as a massive coalition of political and activist groups came together to make a stand against authoritarianism, as well as the likely expansion of Israeli settlements that would have occurred. I attended one of these judicial reform protests with my family on June 3rd, 2023, and I was massively impressed by the turnout of hundreds of thousands and the unyielding energy of the speakers. Like, these speakers are beautiful at these protests. Eventually, all these heavy protests which shut down highways, filled up Tel Aviv every night, led Netanyahu to back down from his bill. However, unfortunately, on March 27, 2025, he still passed a watered-down version, giving him more control over the election of judges. And these protests continued. Following the events of October 7th, the cause of the return of the hostages and the pro-democracy protests kind of coalesced against Netanyahu. Israelis protested in massive numbers against the war in Gaza and pressured Netanyahu to accept a ceasefire and release the hostages. These protests brought in a wide variety of groups across Israel, those seeking hostage return, of course, Arab Israelis also seeking an end to the genocide in Gaza, and pro-democracy activists. Today, now that all the still living hostages have been returned, protests have decreased in size, and Israeli life has begun to return to some form of normal. However, they still continue, as Israelis are not willing to accept the status quo. So, what is my reflection on the protests? Israel has, frankly, a lot of crazy people. I mean, we have Orthodox Jews who have, like, 12 kids and live in these, like, oppressive, like, Jewish, like, you know, settlements where, like, if you're caught, like, on your TV on Shabbat, like, it's over for you. They have to have a kosher phone where, like, it's just like a flip phone. It's like a fruit. And they have a lot of kids, too, which is not good for the future demographics of Israel. And then we also have, you know, revisionist Zionists and illegal settlers. But Israel also has a lot of wonderful, or at least normal people, who are willing to take a stand for justice, right? I mean, the protests in Israel are, like, deeply empowering moments in which I found myself able to, like, take a tangible stand against all these things that I've been seeing, you know, far away as an Israeli American. And they give me, you know, some sense of being less alone in, you know, the resistance to this awful regime of Bibi's. I think they bring in a really massive and, like, well-organized audience and incredible speakers to each protest. And it's, you know, brought me closer with my family as well, and given me something, you know, really, like, actionable. These protests also bring together a wide variety of, like, differently opinionated groups, because Israelis are very used to coalition building. And while these coalitions do sometimes result in, I think, like, weakened messages, like, you know, there can be, like, last time I was there was, like, an Arab speaker who, like, afterwards had, like, you know, speaking about the injustices she faces in, like, in Yaffo, which is the old city of Tel Aviv, which is much more Muslim than Tel Aviv, can be followed up by a protest for a Jewish, you know, democratic state. But I still think they managed to bring a lot of light in a dark time for Israel and, you know, push towards positive change, any sort of positive change. And I also think that's something that we could learn from too here at UCLA. I think, as Americans and as activists, I think we're often really used to this kind of form of ideological purity, and I think we're used to like change being perfect. We want it to be perfect. Of course we want the best, but I think sometimes it's best to accept like just something that's good for now, right? And as a stepping stone for something better. I think a very like harrowing example of this is like, SJP's post being like, yeah, we won't endorse a presidential candidate in, the 2024 election, right? And like, I would certainly say there was a better candidate for both Palestinians and democracy in the election with Kamala Harris, right? And I also think there's a lot of really concerning rhetoric. I think, we leave out room for Israelis like me and for more moderates by using language such as this post on an SJP post, literally like glorifying and legitimizing the horrors of October 7th. I think that's, for me personally, that alone prevents me from attending any of these protests that I would otherwise be happy to join because it's an important cause. And I also think there's a really dangerous kind of notion around the term of Israeli. Like, for example, like there was this professor from, Weizmann, which is an Israeli university, coming to talk about like her work in bioengineering. And like she said nothing about politics, has not participated in Israeli politics, yet someone on Reddit thought it would be a good idea to post, urgent, Israeli professor Anat Levin coming to UCLA tomorrow, with no context at all other than the fact that she's Israeli, and clearly that must merit some sort of action. They didn't even say anything else in the post. And this led to like an actual security force having to be put in at what should have been a routine seminar. I think like it's difficult, especially used to a country with a two-party system, and used to like I think politics as something that we kind of just hear about as far away, and like just wanting the right thing, to just want things to be perfect. But I think sometimes we have to be willing to take like temporary, tangible steps in that sense. So, what does this all mean about being Israeli as started? I think being Israeli to me is still the same thing that it always was. Family, food, and going to Tel Aviv. I mean, my family's all there. But it's also now about wanting what's best for that country that I'm in. I think loving someone or loving something is about being willing and open for its capacity to change, right? And in that sense, I guess I love Israel in the sense that I think it can change, and I think this country can stop committing the horrible injustices and human rights abuses and genocide that it's committed. I think it can improve, and I think that's how I view myself being Israeli now. I think the best way to be Israeli is to fight for what's better and to fight for change in this country that you grew up in, because your family's there, right? We want what's best for them, and I think it really kind of shows the underlying humanity that we all have. I mean, I think it's very easy to just see politics as this us versus them, but the resistance of October 7th means the death of families that I see my own family in, and the attacks in Gaza and the settlement in the West Bank is just a reflection of continued violence. And I think we're all human. We all want what's best for our families, and I think there's a lot of normal Israelis who would be open to this kind of platform. And I think I implore you all to kind of open up room for Israelis like me in your life, to have some sort of activism and leave room for us to do change, because if anything, I think we're the best position to make a difference. I'm traveling later this year to Israel to vote against Netanyahu. I think we can educate our families, we can protest, we can do so much more tangible action than I think people who aren't Israeli, and I think that's really key. I'm going to end with these words in Hebrew by Sumaya Bashir. She's an Arab Israeli, and she's speaking in Hebrew that there is no way out of this hole that Israel has dug itself in without Arab and Israeli cooperation. And it inspired this lecture. Okay.
אין דרך לצאת מהבור הזה שהחברה הישראלית הגיעה אליו בלי שותפות ערבית יהודית אמיצה. לא דו-קיום.
They're saying that the audience is chanting that they're. But yeah, that's it.